It's a relatively straightforward job to do, but it's much easier to do with the engine out of the vehicle. So if you've not already done that, then please do check out the Just Kampers how-to video and then return to this point. The job itself is relatively simple, but we do need to remove the fan housing to gain access to the oil cooler. So we'll just take a look at the tools we need for the job. All of our toolkit is from the basic toolkit. We don't need any specialist tools here at all. So hammer, pliers, mole grips, always useful to have to hand. We have some screwdrivers here and a 10mm spanner for removing the various bits of tinware. 13mm spanner and a socket for removing the bell housing and also the strap that retains either the dynamo or the alternator. A 21mm socket for removing the fan belt, and again you can use a spanner. And then we can move on to the parts themselves. Well, they're very cheap, just 2 little seals down there. And the other thing we're probably going to need is either some brake cleaner or some thinners or engine gunk, however you prefer it, because there's a lot of oil sprayed over that engine. In order to get at the oil cooler, we need to remove the fan housing, and the easiest way to do that is to remove the fan housing and alternator complete. So the first thing we'll need to do is take off the fan belt, then undo the strap that holds the alternator or dynamo down along here. We then have to undo the 2 nuts that secure the fan housing onto the rest of the tinware. And finally, as long as the original flaps that control the airflow inside the cooling system are on, we'll need to disconnect the bellows underneath. And then we should just be able to lift the fan housing up and away. Well, the first thing to do is to remove the fan belt. If you don't know how to do this, check out the JK how-to. And by the time you've done that, you can come back and we'll be on with the next part of the job. Next, we need to undo the strap that's holding your alternator or dynamo onto its stand. In this case, it is an alternator, so it's a slightly fatter bit of kit. And we use the 13mm spanner underneath and the ratchet with the 13mm socket on the top. And it's just literally a case of undoing it. And you have to be careful once it is undone that you don't drop that bottom nut. But usually there's no need to undo it all the way. You can just slacken it off. You may even be able to get your hand in there just to spin it round. And it's probably going to be a little stuck in there because it'll have been there for some time. But you should just be able to wiggle it round like that and then just slide it towards the back so that we can lift it off the stand. If it is a little stuck, you can always just use a screwdriver just to push it along and make sure it's resting up against the alternator backing plate there, and we'll know it will be clear of the stand down the bottom. Next, we need to remove the HT leads from their little clips here, and you can use a little screwdriver there just to pull them out, and then we can leave the rest attached to the vehicle. And you can see down here a cable. It's unlikely you're going to see one of these. This is an earlier single port engine, and it's part of the preheat system for the carburettor, but we shouldn't need to worry about that. It should lift up. And we do the same on the other side. Next, we need to disconnect the coil. Now, if you're not familiar with the electrics, then please go ahead with a little piece of masking tape and actually mark up what they are. Well, this is a 12-volt positive. We know that because it's going off to the electronic shut-off on the carburettor to stop the overrun. And then down the back, there's the wire down to the condenser on the distributor. So we can pull that clear. And finally, we can pull off the main king lead that goes from the coil down to the distributor. Well, this cable here, you're most unlikely to see again. This is an early engine, and that is a separate cable that goes up for the air filter, which I mentioned earlier. So don't worry if your vehicle hasn't got one of these. Next up, we need to undo the bolts that retain the fan housing here into the rest of the tinware. Now, on an early engine, it's just a flat-bladed screwdriver that's required, but it might be an M10 headed bolt here, so you might need that 10mm spanner that we mentioned earlier. So we just need to literally just undo that. Now, on an earlier engine like this, you do have to take the bolt right out. On a later engines, usually there's a little slot at the top there, so you only need to loosen it off, and you can clearly see the retaining captive nut underneath. Okay. And then you do exactly the same on the other side. Okay, we're going to have a look behind the fan housing now, and you can see here this interconnecting metalwork along here, this linkage, which is actually operating the flaps. Now we'll look at the bellows that operate those in a moment, but just so that you know, and you can look through and see this here. And there is actually a spring in here which can stay in situ on this early model one. One thing we do need to move is this, which is the guide tube or the conduit for the accelerator cable. We just need to pull it clear of the rear tinware. Now if you have a later model engine, your oil cooler will actually be sat outside of the fan housing here, and this is the tinware in which it sits, and this portion of the fan housing that comes along will actually be extended to match up with this, and your oil cooler will live down there, but we'll explain the difference later. Well, next we need to lift up the engine. Now it's probably best if you've got somebody else to hand. I've been doing this for a long time, so I'm feeling confident of doing it on my own. And you also need to have something ready. I've got an axle stand here ready to prop the engine up, because the last thing you want is that tipping over when we do the next part of the job. Now you can also do this whilst the engine's still in the vehicle right at the start. But we are looking to disconnect the bellows. So I've made sure that the exhaust is not rusty, and that's going to support that nicely. Give it a little wiggle, make sure it's nice and sturdy, and then we can actually undo the access plate. Well, looking on the sump of this engine case here, we can see there's oil absolutely everywhere. So not only have the oil cooler seals failed, we've actually replaced the flywheel oil seal on this one. It really was a leaker. But you can see this plate here on the right hand side as we're looking from the rear. And one good thing about having all this oil is that none of these are rusted into position, but you might well find that they are quite tight, and you might either need to apply a little bit of heat, certainly some releasing fluid, and maybe a set of mole grips just to start them moving. So there are just the 4 M6 set screws, bolts, whatever you want to refer to them as. So just this last one to come out then. So we take the last one off, and then it should just come loose. And we can see it's absolutely soaked, but this is what we're looking for. We need to gain access to the bellows here. And basically all that happens is the engine heats up, the bellows come apart, and that operates the flaps and puts them to the open position, so all the cooling air goes down over the cylinder heads. Okay, so we'll use the 13mm socket here to crack off the bellows. Should be able to just undo that last bit by hand. Again, all this oil has made sure that's nice and free. And then there is actually a little thread, it's very hard to see on the end there, but there's a rod that goes up between the cylinder head. And all we're looking to do is hopefully, there we go, just give it a turn and undo it. So that, again, that's spinning off, but you might need some releasing fluid on there. And then you can actually leave this in situ if you want and just lift it off. But you do need to make sure that it's right off the last thread. Otherwise, when you try and lift the fan housing, it will actually bend that mechanism. And that is definitely not what we want. There we go, it's now free. So in this instance, I'm actually going to take it out of the way, and then you can see exactly what it is. And there is the thread that the controlling rod goes into. Okay, what I'm going to do now is just put everything together so that we don't lose any of it. And we'll give that a good clean up before we refit it. Take the tools out of the way, and then just put the engine down flat so that we can lift the fan housing. And again, if you're working on a later model engine, the twin port engine, then you need to remove the tinware from the back here. So you take the top one off, and this lower scoop actually fits through a slot in the tinware here, and you'll just withdraw it, bring it up, and your oil cooler will be exposed here. So now we're ready to lift the fan housing. A couple of points to bear in mind. Hopefully we're going to be all right here, and the alternator will clear the carburetor, but we may need to take the carburetor off. Very straightforward, just a couple of M8 bolts under there. And if you don't know how to do it, you can always check the how-to feature. And then it's just a case of lifting hold of the fresh air outlets, giving it a wiggle and lifting up. Now if you do have the twin port one, you may find that it may get stuck around the back. And I've made a classic mistake here. I explained to you earlier about the accelerator conduit. you actually do need to remove it because that was catching underneath the carburettor. So once it's out of the way, this should lift straight up. And there we go, simple as that.
Okay.
So we've got a close-up now of our oil cooler. Remember, this is an early style or single port style inside of the fan housing oil cooler, and there's one M10 nut down there and two more either side at the other end here, which you can only access from slightly underneath. Now, this was a bit of a design flaw with the original air-cooled flat 4, so in the later models, the twin port or doghouse style coolers, the oil cooler is slightly larger and actually lives outside of the main fan housing, so the cooling air can go down over the cylinders just like they do on the other side of the engine here. In that case, you'll have the slightly larger oil cooler, and it will basically be mounted about here in relation to this early style one. Well, as you've seen, there's oil sprayed all over this engine, so the next thing to do before we take the oil cooler off and expose the oil galleries is to give it a thorough cleaning. Now, there are lots of different products you could use. In this instance, I happen to have some Just Kampers supplied brake cleaner, which works very well on this sort of job. And it's always important to bear in mind the environment, any special instructions on the side of the can, and of course wear eye protection in case it splashes back at you, and breathing apparatus just to stop any of the fumes going down your lungs. Okay, we've had a really good clean up then. It's a couple of hours of work. A couple of things to bear in mind. These fan blades here are oh so important, and they were actually covered in oil, caked on, and loads of feathers and bits of grass and leaves and all sorts in there. So make sure you give that a good clean out. One, to keep the fan in balance, and secondly, of course, we need as much cool, clean air going through there to keep your engine cool. Then we look down into the engine itself, and this engine had had so much oil blowing around it and all the dust sticking on it. Some of these fins are actually completely blocked. So it's worthwhile putting in that extra bit of effort and making sure everything's nice and clean, and there's no sign of any debris stuck in between there. Otherwise you'll get hot spots, and that could cause premature piston or barrel wear. Okay, finally we can actually start loosening off the oil cooler, having made sure that all the muck and debris has gone. Now, to start off with, just loosen off this first one, and then we'll undo the two side ones down here and then come back and finally take that one out. Well, the furthest back of those two 10mm nuts was actually loose there, so it might well be that that's where the oil leak was coming from and the seals weren't actually closed up properly. Strange how some things can happen. Just one to go now. Okay, so we've got the other two nuts off. We can just come back and do this one last. I like to leave this one in because it stops everything wobbling over and locking up on the threads the other side. So a little wobble and a gentle lift. And then there we can see one seal still stuck in the case down here, and the other one is actually lifted up. Well, as it happens, I did drop that little M6 nut, but with this handy little magnetic device from Teng, managed to recover it.